All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brand Used. I am your host, Michael Strojny, and today I'll be going over NASCAR's long and rich history. Now, a lot of people probably think that NASCAR is just a bunch of drunk rednecks that, we like to get hammered and we like to hear loud cars and they like to turn left. I mean, you're not wrong. You're completely wrong. Not completely wrong. But what if I tell you that they went from outlaws to a $100 million corporation? And that's the story I'm going to be telling you guys today. It all starts back not in 1948 when NASCAR was first founded, however, but in the 1920s. Now, if you're a history buff, the 1920s were a period of time, obviously, but the 1920s marked something called prohibition. And for a lot of people who don't know, America was a thriving country. We just got off World War I, and people were coming home and excited about going back to bars. But it wouldn't be long before prohibition hit. January 17th, 1920, our story starts. Prohibition begins, and for those who may not know, prohibition is where the Volstead Act was put into place, and what the Volstead Act did is outlaw the sale and consumption of alcohol within the United States of America. There were roughly 1,600 federal agents brought on to enforce the new act. So because of this new act, thousands upon thousands of people across the country wanted their beer and liquor, but they couldn't walk down to share a few buds with their buddies. So what would people do? If you weren't an alcoholic or someone who needed a little bit of the giggle water to have a good time, you just didn't drink. You followed the rules. You were a good boy and a good girl. But for others, it wasn't so easy. For the others, they were a part of the few that liked to partake in America's pastime of drinking. Well, what could you do now that alcohol was outlawed? Well, you could brew your own. For some people, this worked, but it wasn't enough. So what did the others do? They wanted to drink with their friends, so they'd go to a speakeasy. And for those who don't know, a speakeasy is an underground bar that is very well hidden in order to have a place to drink with your friends without the chance of getting caught by the cops. I mean, people did get caught sometimes, but majority of the time, people got off scot-free. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, hey, dummy, how do speakeasies connect to NASCAR, drunk hillbillies turning left and these fancy dressed people, going out to have a good time? Well, I'm going to hit you with a counter question. How do these speakeasies get their alcohol? Huh? Well, that's where rednecks come into play. They used rumrunners. Rumrunners were the people to bring the alcohol to the speakeasies. So, in a time we're obtaining the devil's lettuce, or not devil's lettuce, marijuana, no, alcohol. In the time we're obtaining the devil's juice was impossible legally. We needed people to get it illegally. Legends of Rumrunners are still celebrated today by bars and booze, commonly sharing the name of some of the famous Rumrunners. Some would run via ship overseas to other countries, but today we'll be focusing on those that ran within country lines and would drive across country lines. In the 1920s, cars were nothing like they are today. They were big, boxy, and honestly, very, very, very slow. Back then, the fastest car you could buy on the market was Duesenberg Model J with a horsepower number of 265 with a top speed of 119 miles an hour. Now, for today's standards, that's an average economy car. That's what you see on most of the roads. You see cars ranging from about 200 to 260 with a governed off around 120 miles an hour. So that's average for today. However, that was back in the 1920s, and that was no average car. That was a luxury car. And even then, if you look at times like an important time you need to look at for getting away from cops would be your 0 to 60. With a 0 to 60 of over 8 seconds, that doesn't compare well to cars at today's standards. You have the Chevy Sonic, Honda Odyssey, and the Toyota Sienna all being faster 0 to 60 with 8.5, 7.4, and 7.2 seconds respectively. And like I said, the Duesenberg was a luxury car. Most people couldn't afford that. So what were people buying back then? The average person buying back then? Well, they were buying the Ford V8, the Chevy Coupe, and the Dodge 8. None of which, and I mean this in the most like respectful way to cars of the 1930s, 20s. None of them were breaking any lane speed records anytime soon. The highest horsepower output for a car back then of the ones listed was Dodge 8 with 75 horsepower. Now, I'm pretty sure my farts have more than 75 horsepower on them. But that's besides the point again. But the police cars were heavily modified. So this made sure no normal person was getting away from the cops. So we have a mission, getting the booze. We have our obstacles. The cars are slow. Cops are fast. We need a solution. And this is what the rednecks are good at. Farmers would often modify these cars with the main ideas in mind of more power, more space, and a stronger car. Farmers would Frankenstein these cars together. They would often swap out engines. The common option that most people would put in, for the most Rumrunners would put in, would be the Ford Flathead V8. And they would make this engine as powerful as possible. Then they would also take out a lot of interior panels, including seats, floor panels, and door cards. And they would beef up the suspension to handle the weight of a bigger gas tank, bigger engine, and all that sweet, sweet tipple. Tipple's a word I found scripting this video. It has two meanings. It means a beverage someone can drink to get drunk off of, or you can use it in a sentence like this to describe the act of drinking. Me personally, I love to tipple on Saturdays. But people finally had their answers to combat the vicious federal agents. Farmers would take these cars in Mexico and Canada and play the highest stake game of tags of their life. They would get the goods, get back, and then they'd give people their booze and people would be happy. Sometimes these people would get caught, booze would get confiscated, or as I wrote down, John Barleycorn, because that's a fun name. The John Barleycorn would get confiscated, and they'd lose their license for permanent, and they'd have huge amounts of jail times ranging upwards of 11 years. As the stakes got higher, the cars got faster, and often people started to watch in awe of how fast these cars were going and the skills of these drivers on these old, unlit back roads. It was like, when I was researching this, I found quite a few pictures like of areas the Rumrunners would often drive through, and it's forests. They're doing turns, from my research, about like 65 to 70 miles an hour on these skinny, like this size tire, like a bike tire almost, and they're just whipping it around trees. And I was sitting here typing this. I was like, there's no way in hell anyone today could do that with the cars we have. Like, you would need something specifically made for that. So I have to give a round of applause to these farmers who build these cars. That is impressive in my eyes. The Rumrunners started to make a huge name for themselves, especially with the people watching. There were some of the obvious, like Al Capone, who was made famous for his ties with the mob and mafia. However, Al Capone became an even bigger deal when he started brewing his own liquor and bootlegging it all over the country. Now, from a mobster to a modern-day pirate, is William McCoy. And Bill, trust me, I was great friends with the boy, Bill. Great friends with him. Back in the day, as he was known by Bill, would sail overseas and bring back the finest of non-diluted moonshine. He would also set up floating liquor stores off the coast of New York City on the border of international waters to make sure he did not have to face any of the charges of selling out liquor in America. And while both their legacies are still remembered, Al Capone, obviously, movies, he's one of the names when you think mob back in the day. And then there's William McCoy, who's remembered today with Real McCoy Rum. And now that brings us to a very important name for today's show. Let me introduce to you Robert Glenn Jr. Johnson. Any NASCAR fan knows the name I just said. But if you're a normal person, you're like, who the hell is this? Who's this rando you're talking about? Let me tell you, Johnson was a racer and a moonshiner at heart. His family was the biggest moonshine producer east of the Mississippi, going back to the days of the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Not 1794. Driving was in his blood. As a teen, Junior knew he was a machine behind the wheel when he was carrying pounds, and I mean not pounds, tons of this home brew. Now I should say prohibition ended in the late 1930s. Even though it was legal again, most places still didn't want alcohol on their county lines, and if they did allow it, they had a huge tax on liquor. I just lost track of where I was. God damn. There it is. They had a huge tax on it. Bootlegging in Appalachia was still running rampant. Here's a famous quote that Junior once told the BBC. If it weren't for whiskey, NASCAR wouldn't have been formed. Eventually, after the running started to lighten up, moonshiners had the lovely idea of racing their Franken cars, and people loved it. Thousands upon thousands of people would flood into fairgrounds all across the country and pay great money to watch these Rumrunners showcase their skills they used against the cops on the track against other great bootleggers. In 1938, the first stock car race occurred not far from where I am today, in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. As fans grew in size, the cars got better, faster, and more expensive. And finally, after years of stock car racing, NASCAR was born at the famous beach of Daytona in 1947. And that, my friends, is how a country's disdain for alcohol led farmers far and wide to make one of the top grossing forms of vehicle entertainment the world has ever seen. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Used News. I was your host, Michael Strojny, and I'd like to thank my sources, Britannica, TP Car Collections, Concept Cars, Reed Brothers Dodge History, Way, Wide Open Country, and the History Channel for the information used in today's episode. And that was the history of how rum running had its roots in NASCAR.